Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcy Bellis, Senior Editor of Auto Finance News, and pleased to welcome you to Right-Sizing Your Compliance Staff, presented by the Center for Auto Finance Excellence, the industry resource that shares best practices and actionable advice with auto finance professionals. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar today. This is the first of our four-part 2014 series of webinars presented by the Center for Auto Finance Excellence, the generous support of Fiserv. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Scott Hendricks, Senior Product Manager for Strategic Business Development at Fiserv Lending Solutions, who will offer some introductory remarks. Scott?
Hi, good afternoon. This is Scott Hendricks with Fiserv. Can everyone hear me now? I just want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. For nearly 3 decades, Fiserv's provided comprehensive automotive finance software solutions, as well as BPO services for the captive finance industries for both banks, independent finance companies, and captive finance companies. We're very proud as a sponsor to have partnered with our friends at Auto Finance News to sponsor the Center for Automotive Finance Excellence, and we thank everyone for coming this afternoon.
Thank you, Scott. This webinar, which will last about an hour and is being recorded, will explore exactly how to build, structure, and deploy the right staff to address the current regulatory environment in auto finance. In today's compliance-centric environment, from fair lending to dealer monitoring, education is required for every employee in an auto finance organization, from the boardroom to the call center. And that means employing the right staff. This webinar will address how lenders are being strategic and efficient when rethinking compliance staff levels in light of the potential regulatory actions from Washington, and it will uncover the various skill sets that companies should be looking for when making new hires. The substance of the teleconference harkens to just some of what we do at the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. The center was developed for the benefit of the auto finance community, and we encourage you to join the center at autofinanceexcellence.org to receive content and insights on the practice of auto finance. Fresh articles are added to the site all the time. Some of the most recent delve into preparing for CFPB data requests, the importance of investigating consumer complaints, and putting the service back into servicing. The information we cover today will also provide a taste of what you'll experience at the upcoming Auto Finance Risk and Compliance Summit, which will take place May 5th to 6th in Newport Beach, California. For those who haven't yet signed up to attend, the early registration discount ends this Friday. You can visit autofinancecompliancesummit.com for more information on that. Note that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website at autofinanceexcellence.org. With that, let's get started. We have a distinguished panel of speakers who will participate in the roundtable discussion. Andy Barksdale, Senior Vice President and Managing Director at TruePoint Partners. Terry Horn, Principal Consultant at People Strategies. Eddie Ponce, a compliance expert, and Richard Lewis, Senior Vice President and National Finance Group Risk Officer at Bank of the West. Richard will set the table for us, outlining some of the key points we'll cover in the discussion today. Then my colleague, Cody Lyon, Associate Editor of Auto Finance News, will moderate the panel. Feel free to submit questions via the chat function on the left side of the webinar interface at any time. With that, let me introduce Richard Lewis. Richard is Executive Vice President and Group Risk Officer at Bank of the West, as I mentioned. He's responsible for consumer lending risk management, including the indirect, mortgage, home equity, and card portfolios. He oversees the credit risk, regulatory compliance, decision sciences, collections, and operational risk functions. Richard's industry experience includes senior management roles at Washington Mutual, Providian Financial, and Ford Motor Credit. Richard?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers of this, or actually good afternoon, depending where you're located. I notice we even have someone calling in from Brazil, so good morning to all. As mentioned, I have a brief set of slides to level set the discussion that will ensue with the panel, and the first slide will briefly discuss the overall environment, and then we'll follow on with some initial topics around compliance right-sizing and compliance staffing considerations for both small organizations and larger organizations. So to get started on the auto finance compliance slide, I think it's an understatement to say, and I think everyone is familiar with the fact that the financial services industry overall is operating in an entirely new environment with increased scrutiny and heightened expectations for risk management overall and regulatory compliance in particular. And many would say that this post-crisis environment, of course, began with the Dodd-Frank or Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which in turn led to the formation of the CFPB, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And perhaps most relevant to this discussion are the developments that took place in March of 2013 with the issuance of a bulletin by the CFPB concerning the supervision of indirect auto dealers and their dealer markup practices and the necessary compliance and risk controls that banks and financial institutions need to have, along with the June of 2013 CFPB notice concerning broadened supervision of non-banks by the CFPB that typically had not been under supervision by the OCC, the FDIC, and other regulatory institutions. I think it's also important to note the CFPB's strongly stated focus on the customer experience and the customer perspective. So they have obviously the oversight responsibilities of the FDIC and the OCC for the institutions that they've identified, but with a very, very strong emphasis on customer experience and customer perspective as banks are transacting with them, and what is the implication of that. So the resulting heightened expectations are many and broad, as we all know, and impact an entire organization in every one of its facets. First and foremost, there's an expectation that the very top of the organization will establish and the importance and commitment to regulatory compliance throughout the organization, in essence defining a culture of compliance. There's also an expectation that compliance have direct access and engagement with the board and CEO, and of course, conversely, that the board and CEO are actively engaged and aware of key compliance matters, issues, and their resolutions. The regulators really want to see today a well-functioning three-line of defense framework established in the organizations that they're reviewing, and that this framework is functioning effectively. And for this group in particular, I would note that maybe as one of the objectives in the compliance staffing considerations is the importance of building out your business line's compliance self-testing function. That in a sense that you are able to have business units self-identify issues through their testing and monitoring process and self-remediate long before they become internal audit or regulatory findings. That's really in being a business line risk officer, that's actually a key tenet and a key goal that I think that we all need to work towards is, can we self-contain and say the buck stops here with respect to the business line? That's really, to me, the height of accomplishment of these types of programs. Another differentiation with the new scrutiny and heightened expectations is, I think it's very often the case that smaller institutions, community banks, startups, so on and so forth, are outstanding at handling customer complaints, and they're able to provide that individualized attention to customer issues, which larger institutions may be able to programmatically handle through better systems, but may not be able to give that customized approach, and that can form a very good basis for a great compliance program. But I think it's also important to note that this transactional approach, this historically transactional approach at handling customer complaints effectively on a one-off basis, can often form, that needs to be and graduate itself into an overall program of policies, guidelines, and overall approach throughout the institution that's in writing and can be reviewed by auditors, by the regulators effectively. And then, as many of you know, the regulators expect a sustainable program, and we'll talk about this in the staffing section, meaning that not only do you have a chief compliance officer with a stronger position within the organization, but is there a long-term succession plan for that, for that position, and is there adequate staffing and replacement strategies should that chief compliance officer leave the organization? So it's also an objective to have a sustainable long-term program. And is your internal audit transparent and process and business lines, are they transparent with findings either from compliance or internal audit? And is there an environment that encourages findings and the transparency and the discussion around that, but also the timely remediation of those? And finally, is there a comprehensive and broad communication plan with respect to the overall compliance program and adequate training for staff at all levels with respect to compliance? That's the current environment, and on that grim note, one of the obviously you've all are very familiar with the fact that there's more and renewed focus on fair lending, dealer monitoring, and quite a few other areas for automotive finance companies that needs to be the key of the core program within compliance. So turning to the next slide, historically, and I think this can be said somewhat about credit risk, but probably dating back a bit farther, compliance organizations have typically had a more check-the-box type of approach in institutions dating back, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and typically been organized in a very disparate or decentralized manner, with perhaps reporting into finance or reporting into credit risk or reporting into quality control, and not necessarily having a singular focus or emphasis. I've reviewed programs at institutions with more of a check-the-box type of approach and said, well, what sort of findings have you had? And they said, well, we've had no findings in the last 3 years. Our program is very, very strong. And that may very well be the case in some instance, in a few isolated instances. But the fact of the matter is that regulators and auditors are accepting that a well-run program does have issues. Every institution has issues. It's how you deal with and remediate your findings in a timely fashion that's important in how the organization reacts to those issues, both in a short-term and in a long-term point of view. With respect to the current environment, it's important that key to hiring, and we'll get into more details with the roundtable. But it's key that the chief compliance officer's position and stature in the organization is at a very senior level, as we mentioned before, that it has direct access into the board and to the CEO. If it's a smaller institution, not only do they require specialized skills that are typical of a chief compliance officer, but also multifaceted skills if it's a multi-product type of institution. And I think this also has to be coupled with, there are very strong compliance experts out there and very capable professionals. But for this senior level of a role, there's also a need that that the individual have very strong communications and management capabilities, given the importance of the role and the visibility of the role nowadays. They also need to be able to deal very effectively with regulators, of course. Oftentimes there's a separate group identified in the organization to handle regulatory relations, as given that that's a specialization. But either way, the Chief Compliance Officer needs to be very effective and transparent and a good communicator in dealing with either the OCC, the FDIC, the CFPB, or any other regulatory institution. They need, and the group in compliance in general needs to provide, first and foremost, business oversight and set expectations with respect to business performance, whether that's for error tolerance on compliance monitoring testing, what is the institution's appetite for particular areas of quality control or FCRA testing or whatever the case may be. But additionally, I would note that Chief Compliance Officer and their staff needs to be effective with the business in this oversight role. In other words, it's not just a communication of what is desired, but actually having it that the regulators can see that that Chief Compliance Officer and their staff is effective in having an impact on the business when it's necessary to change behavior. I emphasized a little bit before, but it's worth re-mentioning, self-monitoring and testing at the business level. Again, to me, it's a great goal to have that at the business unit level, compliance findings or internal audit findings are dealt with, identified, and while of course they're shared with higher level groups, the Chief Compliance Officer, et cetera, that the business unit itself is able to self-identify issues, remediate them, and have a self-contained approach, even if they report outwardly, with respect to the remediation of those issues. Compliance is a specialized area, as we all know, but even further specialized, a specialization within a specialization, are some of the skills that are now required, because of the increased scrutiny. Fair lending in particular represents a blend of skills needed. There are specialists in fair lending that work on the statistical testing required. What is the level of disparity, intentional or unintentional, with respect to lending programs. And then there's an interpretive component with respect to, there's the statistics, but there's also the management judgment around those statistical results that's also key, and the sharing and the discussing of that with the business in a straightforward manner to identify issues openly and to remediate where necessary. Dealer monitoring, and we're aware of the Allied DOJ recent action, but to proactively have the skill set to proactively manage and closely work with the business unit on dealer performance with respect to markups, consistency of treatment of clients, and there's both a statistical component there and also a business component of interacting with the business to ensure that the compliance staff has those skill sets and can work adequately with the business and with executive management in identifying issues and where necessary, taking remedial actions. So moving on to staffing considerations, and this is just somewhat to kick off some of the right sizing. I think we're all aware of the fact with the recent environment that there's intense competition for these resources. And then while it's difficult for me and for all of us to really give an exact formula for the right size of compliance resources needed for a particular institution, many of the we can give you factors that are relevant to consider. It depends on, of course, on the complexity of the products offered by that institution, and the breadth of offerings. Do you participate in correspondent mortgage, or are you a fairly traditional lender that goes right down the middle with respect to product structure, so on and so forth. But some of the considerations that we can discuss, I think it's important to recognize there are experts out there with very deep compliance expertise. In other words, strong knowledge of the regulations. Really there it comes down to, do they have the skill set and then the experience in particular of having applied the regs in the particular business context. And that begins to overlap with the second part of the bullet point, which is you want a complement of deep compliance expertise and knowledge and how to apply the regs, but also business line domain expertise to know how to solve problems in the real world as they arise. We've mentioned before, but worth mentioning again, important to the compliance skill set are communication skills with executive management and board. As with many technical subjects, the compliance realm is very, very, can get into some extreme detail, but it's the ability, as with many risk professionals, to communicate that in a simple and comprehensible format to non-compliance professionals and executive management and the board, and really identify the substance of the issue that needs to be decided for them that is critical in compliance staffing. Another thing is, for larger organizations, you may have a mortgage compliance program. Typically, fair lending issues arose in the mortgage realm earlier than they did in automotive lending. And so there may be resources available to consider from mortgage or from the credit card realm that could be rotated into indirect auto. And likewise, we've tried it on occasion, I've seen it work on occasion, is to consider rotation of business line staff into compliance staff roles. It can be long-term beneficial to that business line staff who's eventually going to rotate out, but also accomplish that blend of compliance expertise with business line expertise. I think that when it comes to right sizing, it's going to be very different answers for small institutions, mid-sized institutions, large institutions. But at its core, of course, you'll need a chief compliance officer. And depending on the staff size, you will obviously need a testing and monitoring function. And given the increased scrutiny around fair lending, a good set of fair lending capabilities at the very minimum, whether that's accomplished through 2 individuals or through 100. And then finally, just to round out the discussion, I think I wanted to be a little bit neutral here in these bullet points, because I know that different size institutions are participating in this phone call. But I think there are opportunities and challenges for all the institutions. Smaller startups, small institutions have an opportunity to leapfrog some of the legacy issues, perhaps, that some of the larger institutions are facing today. But on the other hand, they have to make very, very selective hiring choices for their compliance staff, given limited budgets. Perhaps they can only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 compliance staff members. As such, multifaceted skills and hiring at a fairly senior level is necessary with that type of small institution. Typically with a mid-sized or large institution, and I've been at all 3, by the way, there is the risk and the potential backlog of legacy compliance issues. But as we know, oftentimes there's a technology advantage that larger institutions have. They have more investment dollars that they can spend towards this. And prior experience, prior compliance professionals that have experience with mortgage or with card couldn't be rotated in to deal with automotive finance compliance issues. So with that, hopefully that level sets the discussion, and I'm happy to hand it back to our organizer to continue the roundtable.
This is Cody Lyon in New York, and I'd like to welcome everybody for joining us today. I'd especially like to thank the panelists for joining us, and we'd like to start with letting each of them spend a moment just to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about what they do. Let's start with Andy Barksdale.
Hi, Cody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Andy Barksdale. I'm the Managing Director of TruePoint Partners. We're a regulatory compliance organization headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we specialize in fair lending and data analytics.
Next, we have Terry Horn. Terry?
Hi, everyone. My name is Terry Horn, and I'm the Managing Director and Principal Consultant of People Strategies, which is an executive search and human resources consulting organization. We're located out of San Diego, California, and we've been working in this field in the auto finance field specifically for the last 14 years.
And we have Eddie Ponce.
Hi, Cody. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the time. My name is Eddie Ponce. I bring over 18 years of regulatory program building experience in various highly regulated industries, including indirect auto finance for both the captive and non-captive entities.
All right. Well, I want to start with Richard Lewis. I have a threefold question, really, for you. Basically, could you just tell us how have auto finance company staffs and organizations been set up in the past, and what role did compliance play in that, in staffing, and how would you say that's changed over the past couple of years?
Sure, Cody, I'd be happy to address that. My experience, I've been in consumer risk management and including regulatory compliance for about the past 20 plus years, and have been at major financial institutions and also at a captive finance, and also consulted before too in the risk management space. I think with respect to how it was done perhaps 15, 20 plus years ago, oftentimes compliance was less more of a check the box type of approach, as I mentioned in the presentation, and almost a QC type of function and approach, and not as not faced perhaps with the sophisticated level of issues that it's also having to deal with today. In particular, with respect to automotive finance, I think that mortgage, as I mentioned, was probably hit earlier with this and has gone through an evolution. It's no slight. I think that it's just it's gone through. It had more time to evolve its compliance approach and level of sophistication with respect to the issue, because of the issues that have arisen. But I think that over the years, I've seen chief compliance officers being hired at a more senior level. It's probably true that bank institutions were faced with this pressure earlier in the cycle, but now with the CFPB broadening its oversight, the applicability to captive finance companies and to others has been more recently impactful. And so, frankly, the role and stature of the compliance officer has increased in those institutions. The breadth of importance given to that role and the visibility has increased greatly, and staffing levels have definitely have grown especially in terms of dealing with fair lending issues and in particular dealer markup issues and dealer monitoring as a result of recent bulletins and DOJ actions. So,
as this is the roundtable too.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'd like to also just encourage everyone, if you have something that you want to add to anyone's answer, feel free to jump in. Sorry, Richard.
No, go ahead. That was my first answer.
Okay, let me move on to Andy Barksdale. Talk about the need for a single compliance-minded tone from the top, Andy.
Hey, Cody. I think that just to build a little bit off of what Richard had indicated, the expectations by the regulators have gone up. And that expectation translates into an expectation of a culture of compliance. And compliance cannot be within a department. It has to exist as a cultural approach by the organization. Fair lending, which was mentioned several times by way of example, is a cultural approach to business about treating people fair, by way of example, and therefore the entire organization has to adopt that philosophy. So if an organization is going to adopt that cultural approach, it is critical that the executives at the top maintain that philosophy, that perspective, regardless if the door's open or the door's closed and they're talking behind closed doors. Today, it requires a complete focus, an unwavering focus on compliance. And so it's critical because, again, compliance is a team sport. It's not a department. It's not an individual's responsibility. It's the entire team, the entire organization.
So, Cody, this is Richard Lewis. One practical manifestation of that, for example, we've talked about the role and stature of the Chief Compliance Officer and the access to the board and the access to the CEO. Another thing oftentimes that's happening that they're coming through and saying you must establish an executive compliance committee, which is not something that meets periodically and probably includes not just oftentimes includes the CEO or can include the CEO, but it includes the top direct reports to the CEO, and they want to know the minutes from those meetings and the active participation of that executive committee in key compliance matters for the organization.
Okay. I'd like to ask Terry Horn a question. Which human skills would you say have historically been coveted by auto finance companies, Terry?
As it relates to compliance, I think it's safe to say that, people skills are important not only to compliance, but to every position within a business organization. However, I think compliance does often focus on specific and essential skills such as problem solving, adapting messages to its audience, and building trust. It's very important that in the translation of this regulatory information that compliance professionals remain positive in their messaging and create that educational awareness for their operational peers. Innately, people want to do the right thing. They may not always know exactly how to go about doing it, but I do agree with Richard in that, in increasing and promoting that business self-monitoring as things are coming up so it doesn't have to be escalated is very important. And I would say the most successful leaders and compliance professionals that I've worked with within large or even smaller organizations are very focused on team play, and they are highly collaborative with their business partners and operational peers.
Okay. I'm going to ask Eddie Ponce a question. It seems like fair lending and dealer monitoring are two areas that now require additional staffing. What changes have you seen on those fronts, and what should be if you could drill down just a bit, what should be the role of the fair lending compliance officer? And this is a long question, but is there still a need to put focus on monitoring, and how much of a staffing budget should be spent on that focus?
The short answer is yes. I mean, and for two key reasons. Obviously, if you're a depository institution, in a post-Dodd-Frank, CFPB climate, the regulatory landscape, as Richard and others have mentioned, has fundamentally changed. So, that said, even if your institution is not large enough, though, for the CFPB to have jurisdiction over you, at a minimum, it can refer the matter to a relevant, federal or state level regulatory agency. it's good to remember that when the CFPB was created, they were very effective at having information sharing MOUs signed with other both prudential regulators and state-level regulatory agencies. And secondly, I get this question frequently, and that, well, I'm not a large banking institution, or I'm not a large enough entity for the CFPB to directly have jurisdiction over me. That doesn't eliminate the fair lending onus. For example, in New York, to obtain a sales finance company license, institutions require to complete a certificate of fair lending compliance that's basically requiring the institution to certify compliance with Section 296A of New York's executive law. And if memory serves me correctly, there was even a clarification to that law provided in 2003 stating that both sexual orientation and military status has been added to the statute as two more prohibited bases that one needs to consider in their fair lending program. So the point in that is that whether you're whether you're state licensed or whether you have a bank charter of some sort, whether you have direct federal, the prudential regulators as a whole governing you, or state agencies, there's really no disregarding fair lending requirements. And so it's a critical component. And Richard mentioned it in the slides when we started. It has to be focused. So, for larger institutions, it tends to be, an addition, generally speaking, to an existing fair lending program. But even at a smaller institution, it's something that needs to even be, before the institution goes live, it needs to be part of their overall business plan. And so there obviously are challenges on the startup side that the larger institution doesn't have, but at the same time, I'd argue that there are benefits. You're really, for the most part, culturally in a startup organization, you generally speaking have multifaceted individuals. So you're not going to have, most of those institutions that are starting up come from prior backgrounds. Their perspectives, they're going to know about, compliance requirements as a whole, specifically fair lending. So you don't have that educational curve to manage, and more importantly, logistically, you don't have the legacy issues that larger institutions have to deal with. So, you can start from scratch without, for lack of a better term, sort of bad habits, and that's a key advantage. And then as technology, we see this a lot. As technology continues to move forward, you have cloud-based systems being created. That really is closing the gap for institutions to go ahead and enter the market space, do what historically large platforms couldn't do because of technological advancements. So I do see a gap closing, not widening in that respect, and which can sort of level set from a smaller institution perspective.
Okay. Well, before I move on, I just want to remind everyone who's listening that you're more than welcome to submit questions on our on the web interface. So just to put that out there, that if you have any questions you wanted to get in there, feel free. Richard Lewis, I have a question for you about skill sets, and really just what you've seen as far as skill sets, what skill sets should lenders look for when developing and ensuring a quality, fair lending program throughout their organization, Richard?
Well, specific to fair lending, there's the knowledge of, but I think that this answer goes for compliance expertise in general. There's as I said, I think it's good to accomplish within the compliance staff, to seek to accomplish a blend of business domain expertise, because you want the compliance staff to have capable and credible discussions with long-standing business professionals that know the indirect auto business very, very well. So you want them to have credibility and to have that business domain expertise, but you also want to blend that with knowledge of the regs and the application of the regs and the effective management of the business. To provide, it's an oversight, it's a blend, done very, very well. It's a blend of an oversight role first and foremost, but also a business support role. In other words, pointing the business to the right solutions that are compliant and veering them away from non-compliant solutions or proposals that they may be coming forward with, and that's a blend of communication, leadership, deep knowledge of the regs, deep knowledge of how to apply the regs, and deep business operations experience. Sometimes you can get that in a single individual. With a larger organization, the larger the organization, of course, the more that can be accomplished through a blend of either former business professionals that rotate into compliance, as I mentioned, but you definitely need the backstop of certified regulatory professionals, at its core.
Okay. Well, what about non-banks? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to elaborate further on that, Cody, to what Richard said, is that, a lot of times, there are institutions should be on the lookout for sort of the diamond in the rough. And so if they are in an organization where they have a lot of manually based operational control structures, often is the case, and I've seen this personally and given this guidance to others, is in that organization, there inherently is someone there who's probably been in the organization for some time and has the knowledge, the secret sauce operationally with a lot of manual processes. Often that is a key person that can be used either formally to transition to a compliance department if one is being developing it from scratch, because that knowledge that individual has or those individuals have are essential. I mean, we mentioned it earlier in the call, but knowing the rules and the requirements and the statutes and the regs is one thing, but the real value is in the application. And so having that knowledge base of someone like that, where you have a lot of manually based controls in place, they will allow you to go ahead and lead to what an effective modification and process would be like, until you're able to go ahead and move to a more automated type environment. And then on the automated side, I've seen this as well and experienced this as well personally, where we've brought in, basically on there's always an enterprise architect that is coordinating these technological changes, basically creating a more automated type environment. Those people, their function is essentially what you want, because they're basically root cause analysis people. And so they are, they may not know the source of the requirement, but they're giving requirements by multiple departments, and they figure out how to effectively implement that from an IT infrastructure perspective. So that person or that team or those group of people who have that expertise and knowledge of your systems, whether it be front, back end, or what have you, are key, and are key tools to at least use from a, if you're the chief compliance officer in your leadership position, in terms of ensuring an effective compliance program, or often is the case that I've seen is that they've been adopted into the program, into the department, as a IT compliance expert. So really, you have to look at your institution and say, what is my control environment? Is it heavily automated? Is it heavily manually based? And maybe it's both. And so you want to look into that institution and see where you have people who effectively know those controls, even though they may not know, what the statute or regs apply, but that can be taught.
I agree, Eddie. And Eddie, I was just going to add, I think I completely agree with what Eddie's saying, and I think another important factor, I think those are great finds when you can find that type of individual who has the institutional operational knowledge. And then the other piece of it is, do they have the propensity to get into the compliance realm in terms of its demands and its skill set requirements? But I think I absolutely agree that's a great source for what can go into a good compliance program.
For Eddie, I just wanted to ask you this as well, and Richard, and all four of you can weigh in on this really. What about non-banks? I mean, do they need to focus as much on developing and supporting a fair lending program within the overall compliance program? And if so, what sort of unique training challenges might they face? Eddie?
Well, sure. I'll start it off. I mean, it's a little bit what I spoke to before about, really
Right.
the fair lending obligations can't be escaped, and so even if you're a state licensed entity, they're going to apply, and so it's a matter of ensuring that that's part of your overall business plan. I mean, it's that important. And then secondarily, I think it's important to note that, a lot of times when we go on these calls or we talk to other colleagues or whatnot, we hear about compliance programs at large formal institutions. And it's important to go and put that contextually, because if I'm a prudential regulator or I'm a state regulator examining an up-and-coming institution or a smaller institution, the program that's in place at a large conglomerate is not necessarily the program that a smaller institution has to have. So I think that's an important contextual component to go ahead and come in to realize. So if I'm in a large institution with a huge portfolio and a nationally based dealer network, the expectation is that, I would think that you're going to have a regression model in place. But if you're a one state player, or even a regional player with a very small portfolio relative to, the large captives or larger financial institutions, a comparative model is going to be fine. So it's definitely important, but I think it's also important to contextually put what one program is in terms of being deemed effective for one institution isn't necessarily what's going to be required at a smaller institution. So there is that sort of contextual importance.
Okay. Terry, I wanted to ask you again about skill sets, and what are you seeing as far as the skill sets that are in the highest demand right now, and what are some tangible ways staffing skills are changing?
Sure. I'd like to just tack on to what Richard and Eddie said about developing and supporting programs, and more about developing and supporting your compliance professionals within the organization by giving them access to external resources, whether it be associations, conferences, memberships, or training, just because the benefits of that networking and sharing best practices really helps the learning process. Again, we've talked about so many different size organizations, and the startups can learn from the bigger players, and sometimes the bigger players learn things from the startups as well. So I think it's really important for that things like this to continue to happen. But in terms of skill sets that are highest in demand, I can say we are seeing more requests to seek out professionals from both state and federal agencies due to their understanding of the interagency environment, as well as the ability to navigate through reviews and audits successfully. Some of the things that are most important, I think, are to seek out, specific accomplishments and experiences as it relates to dealing with these regulatory entities. And it's important to make sure, as you're interviewing externally, to make sure that these candidates can provide you specific examples of work that they've done and what the results of that were. Asking candidates to provide specific examples of their ability to plan, analyze, to think laterally, influencing others, and manage projects are really key skill sets that can determine the success of a compliance professional these days. But I would say that, there's no formula that's going to fit every situation, depending on your company size. Whether you're a bank or, a lending organization, depends on a lot of different criteria and, what you're regulated against, as the pros have just mentioned on the phone. I would suggest that you conduct, a thorough needs assessment within your organization with your top business peers to determine what resources you have available and then what your immediate needs are, as well as what your long-term plan is.
Andy Barksdale,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. How would you say the reporting structure, the company's hierarchy, so to speak, is that changing, or has that changed at banks and finance companies? In other words, to whom should the compliance staff be reporting to?
Yeah. So a couple things, Cody. First of all, I think that along with the other panel members, I think that this laundry list of skill sets is incredibly important. Knowledge of the auto industry, knowledge of the consumer regs, knowledge of the ability to communicate the great teamwork, great leadership, knowledge of regression, ability to do comparative analytics, the ability to successfully apply the regs into your existing working environment. I mean, all those things are extremely important. The difficulty you have is trying to find someone with everything. And I think that others have alluded to it. You got to do a needs assessment, but you also have to be prepared to understand where you're willing to compromise. And so with that as context, as recently as yesterday, I was having a conversation with an auto finance organization that has or had a compliance officer recently resign, and I asked what that individual did, and they explained that they were in charge of like maybe 4 or 5 areas. So not only were they in charge of compliance, but it technically only represented about 20% of the time that they devoted to helping the rest of the organization do other things. Well, in such a defined job, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the organization. It puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the individual to try to do everything so well. And so I really feel for the smaller organizations in this marketplace. I think Richard said up front that, to use a more simple term, that compliance really needs a seat at the big boy table. They need to have access to the C-suite. They need to have direct access to the board, and should they not have that, they're at in my opinion, a disadvantage in today's marketplace. With that said, historically what we've seen is a compliance officer that might have had multiple roles and could have reported to anywhere in the organization, and compliance would have been a facet of their element. Today we're seeing more dedicated compliance officers, especially the larger the organization. You can get into departments and committees and groups, but I think the one biggest consistent trend is the increased pressure by the regulators is really requiring a more direct dialogue with senior management, whether that's via committee and the board. And so therefore these dotted lines are turning into direct lines with responsibility directly into the CEOs and reporting directly into the board.
Well, that leads right into a really interesting question that we've got from our audience, and I'd like to ask all of you this. Really, it's are compliance officers or leaders gaining any influence over business buying and partner decisions?
Cody, this is Eddie. I'll take a stab at that. Here's some recent conversation I had in the past few weeks, and the common theme in all of them is, compliance as a competitive advantage. So what you're seeing, Andy alluded to this in terms of having a seat at the big boy table, but really, it's a part of the business plan. And where I've seen programs be successful, they've recognized that not only do they have a regulatory obligation in whatever capacity, state, federal, but also their investors, if they're securitizing, other business partners, and internally, part of their competitive advantage with others is, can I get compliance right? And so compliance is a competitive advantage I've continually heard and seen time and time again repeated. And that really is, that's to me, from my perspective, the deciding factor. So which is a cultural shift, because that wasn't always the case. But as you see more of the environment, the regulatory landscape putting that onus on there, especially with institutions who are securitizing portfolios, Wall Street is asking that question more. Outside investors are definitely asking that question, because nobody wants to, buy something, whether it be a portfolio or invest in an entity who's not getting that right.
All right,
Cody,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Cody. Go ahead. If we're out of time, that's fine. I was just going to compliment Eddie's.
Yes, we are running out of time, and I was just going to ask for one last question, and if anyone had anything to add. But as far as, I guess, I just wanted to ask you all this question. What are some of the bigger challenges for a smaller company? And I think we've sort of touched on this, but how can smaller firms meet the challenges that, with a bigger bank you have, of course, probably a built-in infrastructure, but how can a smaller company meet these compliance challenges efficiently? Richard?
Well, I think that, there are some advantages, as discussed, to smaller institutions, and that they don't necessarily have the legacy issues that some of the larger institutions have, but they have a long way to go in terms of building up those capabilities. And as pointed out by Andy and by others, they need to be very, very selective in finding that very, very multifaceted individual. I think the other thing worth emphasizing is that it's good to build, I know that this is going to continue happening, but so many compliance programs have been built out because of a particular compliance finding or a regulatory issue that arose or an MRA. And I've seen compliance programs built up overnight, in a rush and so on and so forth. It's so important to have sort of a sustainable long-term approach to compliance and an acknowledgement that this is a necessary investment for the long run so that you are ready with your compliance program when things arise and that it's more well thought out as opposed to developed under a crisis. So I think there's been benefits to the attention to compliance because of the crisis, for better or for worse, unfortunately. But I think that the fact of the matter is it's here to stay in many forms, and the fact of the matter is a longer-term approach investment to it will lead to much better compliance programs.
Eddie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, look, I concur with what Richard said. I mean, that is really the environment that we're left in is really, you have to build something, you build it for the long term, not the short term. It has to be, even if you're in a finding type environment, you cannot think, okay, this is merely a patch. It is part and parcel of the foundation of the institution, and to not think of it from a foundation level perspective really is not a long-term solution. At best, it's an aspirin to the overall problem. So yeah, I completely agree with Richard.
Cody, one last build on.
Terry, go ahead, Andy.
I would not recommend that you have such a long laundry list of items than which you want to hire from, and not be willing to compromise or look to outsourcing to plug in some of the weaknesses. There are some specialized areas about auto finance that sometimes you can look to others to help provide that expertise and insight. And so while you're looking for somebody that can do all of these wonderful components to be a leader and a great communicator and a regulatory expert, there are opportunities to outsource and look to partners outside your organization to bring efficiency and scale to your team.
Okay. Terry Horn, do you have anything you want to add?
I really don't. I was just going to say I think everyone's covered everything. It's important, though, to seek outside assistance if you don't have that expertise internally. It's just an area that you can't afford to make any errors in at this point.
All right, everybody. I'd really like to thank each of you for joining us today at our webinar. I hope you'll visit us at the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. We have some great content there. We hope that you'll visit us there, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you again so much.